March 3, 1943, over the Bismarck Sea. Somewhere above the swirling clouds of the Bismarck Sea, 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Ray Mercer sat in the tail of a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The vibration of the engines pulsed through the fuselage like a heartbeat made of steel and fire. The Pacific sun flashed off the aluminum skin, but Ray barely noticed. His gloved hands clenched the twin handles of the Browning .50 caliber machine guns as tracer rounds from the Japanese Zeros stitched the air around them. He spotted one, sleek, silver, and deadly, cutting across the horizon at incredible speed. Instinct took over. He centered the crosshairs on the enemy aircraft, squeezed the trigger, and unleashed a stream of bullets. The barrels glowed, smoke curled around him, and for 3 long seconds, he believed he had it. But the Zero didn't flinch. The stream of tracers passed harmlessly behind it. Then the fighter rolled, dove under the bomber's belly, and vanished into the glare. A second later, a flash bloomed off the right wing of another B-25 in formation. One more American crew gone. Ray swore under his breath. He'd done everything right, or so he thought. What Ray didn't know was that across the entire Pacific, from the jungles of New Guinea to the coral skies of the Solomons, the same story was playing out thousands of times every day. Brave men, good shots, empty sky, and missed kills. In that spring of 1943, U.S. aerial gunnery was in crisis. Gun camera footage analyzed by Army Air Force's intelligence told the brutal truth. Trained gunners, even those with perfect aim, were landing hits less than 4% of the time. That meant out of every 100 bullets fired, 96 went wide. A bomber's engagement with an enemy fighter often lasted 10 seconds at most. Each gunner might fire 130 rounds. 4 or 5 would connect, maybe fewer. And a Japanese Zero, or a German Focke-Wulf 190, could take 20 or 30 hits before going down. The math was unforgiving. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force alone was losing nearly 200 bombers a month. Each carried 10 men. Every 30 days, 2,000 fathers, brothers, and sons vanished into the clouds. They weren't failing from fear or lack of training. They were failing because the laws of physics had outgrown human instinct. Ray didn't know the word for it yet, but what killed his chances that morning was called deflection error. When he fired, he was shooting at where the target appeared in that instant. But by the time his bullets reached that spot, the Zero had already moved on. At 300 miles per hour, a fighter crossed more than 400 feet every second. The bullets from Ray's Browning M2 took roughly a third of a second to travel 300 yards. In that time, the Zero had already slipped forward by 130 feet. So Ray's perfectly aimed burst had traced a line through air that was empty by the time it arrived. Multiply that by thousands of gunners across hundreds of planes, and the results were catastrophic. It wasn't that they couldn't shoot. It was that they were all aiming at ghosts of the past. Training manuals mentioned leading the target, but in practice, it was almost impossible to get right. Gunners were told to aim ahead of a moving target, but how far ahead depended on range, speed, angle, and even altitude. At 300 yards, a gunner might need to aim 15 to 20 feet ahead. At 400 yards, almost 40 feet. Yet from a vibrating, freezing turret, looking through fogged goggles and an oxygen mask, that was an eternity of space. They were being told to aim at nothing, to trust that the enemy would fly into their bullets. Every instinct in the human brain screamed against it. The mind wanted certainty, a visible connection between eye and target. The idea of aiming into empty sky felt like madness, especially when your life depended on hitting first. So as the Zero grew larger in Ray's sights, his brain overruled his training. Like countless others, he centered the crosshairs and fired straight at what he could see. The result was the same every time. Clean misses, wasted ammunition, and incoming fire that didn't miss back. At training schools like Laredo, Texas, and Kingman, Arizona, instructors had tried to correct the problem. They used towed sleeves pulled by training aircraft, or ground simulators that moved cardboard targets across projection screens. Cadets practiced for weeks, firing thousands of rounds, trying to master deflection shooting. Yet, even after graduation, most still couldn't apply it in combat. In controlled conditions, they could hit a predictable target. But when the enemy dove at 350 miles per hour, rolling and climbing, instinct and adrenaline took over. And instinct was always wrong. Gun camera footage told the story. Many gunners started by aiming ahead, but after missing their first few bursts, they panicked. You could see the tracers walk backward across the film frame, inching closer to the center of the target, until they were firing directly at it again, and missing again. The footage became a grim pattern, bullets trailing behind fleeing enemies, frame after frame of tracers cutting beautiful, useless arcs through the sky. By the autumn of 1943, commanders were desperate. Loss rates over Europe had reached breaking point. During the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, 60 bombers, 1 in 5, never came home. The men who returned were furious and hollow-eyed. They had done their part, but the numbers didn't lie. Something was fundamentally wrong. The answer, it turned out, had been written down almost 2 decades earlier, and then forgotten. In 1925, long before the world had ever seen an air battle, an artillery officer named Lieutenant Colonel Alton Briggs wrote a paper titled The Problem of Aerial Lead. Briggs had fought in the trenches of World War I, where he'd learned that hitting a moving object wasn't about perfect aim, it was about prediction. He calculated that once aircraft exceeded 150 miles per hour, the required lead angle became too large for human intuition. At 250 miles per hour, a gunner would need to aim 5 entire plane lengths ahead of a target crossing at medium range. His charts were clear. At 200 yards and 300 miles per hour, lead by 45 feet. At 400 yards, nearly 90 feet. Briggs warned, without mechanical assistance, aerial gunnery will become a matter of luck, not skill. But his superiors didn't listen. In the 1920s and 30s, aircraft were still slow and doctrine conservative. Commanders believed good marksmanship could overcome everything. The paper was filed away, forgotten in a cabinet at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Then the Second World War arrived, and his prophecy came true. When America entered the war in 1941, its aerial gunnery program was still teaching World War I techniques. Students fired at static or slowly moving targets. The exercises rewarded precision and control, not instinctive timing. The Army believed that American skill with rifles would translate to machine guns in the sky. It didn't. Now, in 1943, the same Army was losing airmen faster than it could train replacements. The archives were being combed for answers, and somewhere in a dusty box, a young officer rediscovered Briggs's forgotten paper. The math hadn't changed. Physics didn't care about patriotism. The missing link was clear. Humans couldn't consciously compute deflection at combat speeds. If the brain couldn't solve the equation, something else had to, instinct or machine. Far below, over the Bismarck Sea, Ray Mercer had no idea that a revolution in gunnery was already underway. He just knew he was alive, his ammo belts were empty, and his hands were shaking. Another Zero had dived away into the clouds, untouched. In the quiet between attacks, he stared out into the sunlit haze and wondered what it would take to finally hit one of them. What none of them realized was that within a year, the answer would come, from both science and instinct, working together. And it would begin with the most radical idea any gunner could imagine. Aim behind what you want to hit. August 1940, Biggin Hill Airfield, England. On the other side of the world, 3 years before Ray Mercer ever took to the skies, another kind of battle had already exposed the same flaw in human instinct. The Royal Air Force was bleeding during the Battle of Britain. Skilled pilots, brave to the core, fired endless bursts at crossing German fighters, and missed nearly every one. Squadron records showed a hit rate of barely 6%. Even Britain's finest couldn't overcome what physics demanded. That's when a commander named Howard Darcy decided to break the rules. Darcy wasn't a scientist or a mathematician. He was a clay pigeon shooter. And he understood something few others did. No one calculates a lead on a flying bird. You feel it. You swing, you shoot, and your body does the math for you. So, in late August 1940, Darcy did the unthinkable. He grounded his entire squadron. No sorties. No patrols. Instead, for 3 days, his pilots fired at towed targets and banners, not while holding steady, but while moving their aircraft through the turn, shooting with motion, not precision. The results were disastrous at first. The tracers missed by what looked like miles. But he told them to keep firing, keep trusting their movement. By the 40th pass, the pattern began to change. Tracers started walking into the targets. Hits multiplied, then doubled, then tripled. The pilots who had missed every shot a week earlier were now scoring hits at rates no one had seen before. Darcy wrote in his combat report, "It seems the less they think, the better they shoot." What he'd discovered was that the conscious mind was too slow to compute the necessary lead. But the subconscious, the body, the instinct, could adapt. Fighter command began to spread the word quietly. Fire while moving. Don't aim at it, flow with it. By 1941, instinctive deflection had become an unspoken doctrine of the RAF. Pilots no longer tried to calculate where to aim. They let their motion, their training, and their eyes decide. Across the Atlantic, American observers took notes. But U.S. bomber gunners couldn't move the way Spitfire pilots could. They were trapped inside steel frames, their guns fixed to turrets. What the British could solve through instinct, the Americans would have to solve through invention. 1942, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a small, sharp-eyed engineer from Missouri, sat in a lab full of spinning gyroscopes, oscilloscopes, and chalkboards covered in equations. He led a secret division within the MIT Radiation Laboratory, and his mission was audacious: build a gunsight that could think ahead. He called it the Mark 14 computing gunsight. It was an analog computer, powered by gyroscopes and gears, that could calculate the necessary lead angle in real time. The gunner simply tracked the target for 2 seconds, dialed in its wingspan, and the sight's moving reticle glowed not on the target itself, but ahead of it. It showed the future, not the present. In tests at Eglin Field in August 1943, gunners who'd struggled to hit 5% of their shots were suddenly landing over 20% within days. The numbers were so dramatic that test officers initially suspected faulty instruments. But the proof was in the wreckage. The first squadrons equipped with the new sights shot down twice as many attacking fighters in half the time. It was as if someone had handed them a glimpse into tomorrow. The problem, however, was production. Each Mark 14 took time, materials, and precision assembly. Only new bombers received them. Thousands of crews in combat were still flying with simple ring-end bead iron sights, the same technology used since the 1920s. They couldn't wait for factories. They needed a fix right now. March 1944, aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Central Pacific. Staff Sergeant Bill Fleming, a veteran turret gunner, had survived 31 missions and 4 ditchings. He was tired, sunburned, and almost deaf from years of firing the .50s. But in his off hours, he carried a small notebook. Inside, he'd drawn sketches of enemy aircraft, Zeros, Vals, Betty bombers, with lines marking where he had aimed and where his bullets had hit. Over dozens of missions, a pattern had emerged. Every time he scored a hit, his aim point had been ahead of the target, sometimes by 2, sometimes by 3 plane lengths. He showed the notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's famed flying ace. O'Hare understood instantly. What Fleming had created wasn't just notes. It was a field solution to the hardest problem in aerial combat. O'Hare ordered Fleming's method tested fleet-wide. It became known as the plane length rule. The concept was simple enough for any sailor to grasp. During drills, one man would walk along the flight deck holding a wooden model of a plane on a stick. The gunners practiced aiming ahead by 1, 2, or 3 model lengths, depending on the target's angle and speed. No math. No calculation. Just visualization. When the USS Bunker Hill tested the system in March 1944, hit rates doubled. Soon, the Lexington, Enterprise, and Essex carriers adopted the method. In less than a month, it spread through the Pacific Fleet. What the Mark 14 accomplished with gears and gyroscopes, Fleming's rule achieved through muscle memory and imagination. The beauty was psychological as much as practical. 50 feet ahead meant nothing to a man staring through a gunsight in battle. But 2 plane lengths was something he could see. Back in Europe, the Army Air Forces took notice. They adopted a similar concept called radius of action shooting, training gunners to visualize the proper lead as measured in wingspans rather than feet. Manuals were rewritten, and diagrams filled with curved trajectories replaced the old static silhouettes. By mid-1944, American training in England had been completely overhauled. Gunners now fired thousands of rounds at high speed, crossing targets. Instructors used films and simulators to teach the geometry of motion not as theory, but as instinct. And for the first time, bomber losses began to fall. The percentage might have seemed small, a drop from 5.2% per mission to 3.4%. But in the scale of war, it meant hundreds of planes and thousands of lives saved every month. The improvement was so dramatic that commanders realized they were witnessing more than a tactical success. It was a mental revolution. Every successful gunner now carried 2 weapons, his Browning and a new way of thinking. When Ray Mercer climbed into his turret for another mission, He no longer centered his crosshairs on the target. He led with his motion, watching the enemy's trajectory as if anticipating where the world itself was moving. The tracers no longer chased shadows. They met the enemy head-on. For the first time in his young life, he saw a Zero catch fire from a burst he had placed not at it, but ahead of it. And that was when he understood. He wasn't aiming to hit what he saw. He was aiming to hit what would be. January 1945, Gunnery Training Base, Tyndall Field, Florida. By the final winter of the war, the roar of the training ranges echoed day and night across the Gulf Coast. Rows of young airmen lined up at turret simulators and moving target ranges, their gloved fingers resting on the twin triggers of .50 caliber guns. The instructors said little. The machines did the talking. Motorized turrets whirled. Towed targets streaked past at 300 miles per hour. The sound of gunfire rolled like thunder across the sand. Tracer lines curved through the air, arcs of mathematics made visible. Each flash was a lesson, each miss a reminder. And slowly, through thousands of repetitions, a strange kind of second sight began to form. Psychologists studying the trainees called it automatic deflection response. Gunners who once froze under stress now reacted without thought. The instructors had discovered the key. Stop teaching with words and let the nervous system learn through rhythm and motion. When the eyes saw movement, the hands moved with it, ahead of it, guided not by logic, but by muscle memory. Combat reports confirmed the change. Rookie gunners who completed the new 10-week courses were hitting at rates once reserved for veterans. The hit percentages climbed steadily, from 5 to 10 to 20. Even under the terror of attack, their hands no longer betrayed them. They had learned to aim where the enemy would be. Meanwhile, researchers back at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology were refining Draper's mechanical masterpiece. The Mark 14 gunsight evolved into the Mark 18 lighter, faster, more precise. It was still analog, still spun by gyros, but now its gears were enclosed against moisture, its optics sharper, its reticle steadier. In the field, crews called it the brain. Mounted in turrets and cockpits across Europe and the Pacific, it became the unseen partner of every gunner. For the first time in history, man and machine shared a single instinct, prediction. When a Zero or a Messerschmitt crossed the field of fire, the glowing dot in the sight slid ahead of it, as if possessed of its own will. The gunner followed the dot, not the target, and the rounds met the enemy exactly on time. What had once been an act of faith was now a matter of precision. The numbers told the story. By mid-1944, Allied aerial gunnery had achieved an average hit rate above 20%, a five-fold improvement in just 2 years. Bomber losses dropped. Mission survival rose. And perhaps most importantly, morale soared. Men who had once felt helpless behind their guns now trusted the invisible laws that guided them. The transformation went beyond equipment. It became psychological, almost philosophical. Combat researchers described a recurring mental state among seasoned crews, a stillness that emerged amid chaos. Bullets ripped through aluminum, engines screamed, oxygen masks froze solid, yet inside the turret, the mind went quiet. No panic, no calculation, only movement and timing. Japanese warriors had a word for it, mushin, no mind. In that state, the archer draws, the swordsman cuts, the gunner fires, all without thought. Pure flow. American trainers began to notice the same phenomenon. The best gunners were no longer thinking in distance or angles. They had transcended the math. Their reflexes, honed through endless drills, had fused with the mechanics of the sight. Human and machine had become one predictive system. But mastery came at a cost. It required ammunition, fuel, and time, luxuries the war rarely allowed. Most crews never reached the level of automatic precision. Replacements rotated into combat faster than they could adapt, and Luftwaffe pilots learned to recognize the difference. They attacked new formations first, sensing hesitation in the gunners' arcs of fire. Even so, by 1945, the change was unmistakable. Entire formations now held their own against swarms of interceptors. The sky that had once belonged to the hunter now belonged to the defenders as well. When the war ended, the lessons did not. Draper's work at MIT laid the foundation for an entirely new science, inertial guidance. The same gyroscopes that helped gunners predict where to aim soon guided missiles, submarines, and spacecraft. The principle remained the same: measure motion, anticipate trajectory, and act before the target arrives. The Mark 14 evolved into radar-assisted gunsights for the Korean War, then into digital fire control computers aboard the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam. Each generation compressed the process of prediction from seconds to milliseconds to microseconds. Today, the idea lives inside the heart of modern defense. The Navy's Phalanx CIWS, a 20mm Gatling cannon, fires 4,500 rounds per minute. Its radar and software track incoming missiles, updating deflection thousands of times per second. It aims not at where the threat is, but at where it will be. The gunner no longer sits behind the trigger. The machine carries his instinct forward. The same logic governs air-to-air missiles, drones, even video games. A teenager in a simulator learns through the same frustration that once haunted Ray Mercer. That if you aim where you look, you will miss. To hit a moving world, you must fire into the future. Back in the spring of 1945, Ray returned home. He never forgot that lesson. Sometimes, when he sat on his porch at night and watched cars glide past on the highway, he could almost feel the weight of the turret handles in his palms. The hum of the engines was gone, but the rhythm remained, that invisible calculation between motion and time. He understood now what the war had really taught them. It wasn't about machinery or marksmanship. It was about changing how humans perceive reality. The greatest victory wasn't that the Allies had outproduced the enemy. It was that they had learned to retrain instinct itself. From the moment those early gunners stopped firing at what they saw and began firing at what they knew would be there, everything changed, not only for war, but for every technology that followed. And so the story came full circle. A 19-year-old in a freezing turret had once aimed at an enemy he could see and missed every shot. A few years later, he aimed at empty sky and struck true. Between those moments lay the entire evolution of human understanding, the bridge between reflex and reason. The machines grew smarter, the pilots faster, but the principle endured. Whether in the cockpit of a bomber, behind a radar screen, or at a console decades later, the truth remained the same. To survive in a moving world, you cannot aim where it is. You must aim where it will be.